Well, thank you very much for having me. I am so bullish that this will be the decade we will solve globally some of the biggest challenges that face us in healthcare, in energy, and in education. And key to this future will be our capacity to harness the full power of new technologies and to connect with entrepreneurs and innovators inside and outside of the public sector. And if you'll indulge me this afternoon, I'd love to talk about the role you might play in enabling and fostering these problem-solving equations. A little bit of personal journey to get us down this road. I spent the good part of my professional life growing up at the dawn of the internet era. I had the honor and privilege of serving in the private sector first as one of the bankers at Morgan Stanley, where my colleagues had been taking Netscape public to begin this whole movement towards internet and internet-fueled economic growth. I studied the impact that the internet might have on public policy and spent a great deal of my time thinking about its particular applications in healthcare before I had the opportunity of answering the public sector call, both in Virginia and at the White House. I share that quick sojourn to remind us of the unique opportunity that Time magazine has afforded us to think about entrepreneurship in the public sector. Many of us in the early 1990s to mid-1990s understood that entrepreneurs in the public sector were really masters of the art craft of economics, micro and macroeconomic thinking. Most notably, the Committee to Save the World that adorned the cover of Time magazine shortly after addressing one of the many international financial crises that had come to know the global markets. Yet that story of economic entrepreneurship in the public sector seems to be handing the baton off to a new chapter of entrepreneurship in the public sector. And it's memorialized by the cover of Time magazine in the aftermath of the challenges on healthcare.gov in the United States. Dubbed Code Red, the story featured a new type of policy entrepreneur who came to Washington to rescue the very specific technical challenges at healthcare.gov, but more broadly to give scale and opportunity to a whole new way of thinking about problem solving in the 21st century era. Today's conversation is about that story, about how entrepreneurs and innovators from the public and private sector are increasingly working together to tackle some of the biggest challenges, not just in the United States, but around the world. A word of context for how this story began. It is today quite the norm to speak of the government in a lagging fashion relative to the private sector and its use of new technologies. And I'm sure many of you, as you approach prospects in the public sector, often begin the conversation with what you might offer to help close this proverbial technological or innovation gap between what's been adopted and at scale throughout the private sector and what's widely been seen as the capability of the public sector. No doubt there are challenges technologically within the public sector, but I thought to begin with some context. It has not always been thus. At least in the United States context, pioneering government had been the mantra more often than not. It was very common to find that the public sector itself had uncovered and deployed new technologies, often at a pace faster and more widely adopted than even in the private sector. My good friend and author Michael Lind cataloged many of these innovations in his book Land of Promise. And he spoke of many decades of entrepreneurial activity, whether it be how we thought of manufacturing in the defense establishment, thinking about the arsenal system and the spillover benefits it ultimately had in the manufacturing context in the civilian economy, to even some of the design work. If any of you visited Washington, D.C. and you've been to the National Building Museum, what you may not know is its origins were entrepreneurial. Designers were trying to find ways at that time to make it easier for the pension program to process veterans' benefits. And given the sheer magnitude of paper, they designed very clever paper-pushing trolleys that young boys, and at the time they were young boys, could use to more efficiently move paper in between clerk desks who could process the applications. And perhaps most obvious for many of us in this room, dating back to the late 1800s and its Census Bureau, the challenge in our country was to deal with growth on behalf of the immigrants who'd come to the United States and the inability of our census systems to keep up. It had been foreseen that at the time, the ability to hit the census once every 10 years would miss its mark for the first time in the latter half of the 1800s because so many more people had come in, but our technological capacity to process all of those new entrants hadn't kept pace. Yet it took an entrepreneurial public sector employee, Hollerith, who had designed and deployed a tabulating machine, which all of you know found its way into one of the original technologies that made up IBM. We see pockets of this, even in today's era. In 2009, as we entered the public sector in the White House when I served as Chief Technology Officer, one of the most entrepreneurial agencies, NASA, had its hands in not one but several cloud computing initiatives that have found their ways even today in successful organizations like HP. NASA had been one of the early adopters of an NSF-funded program called VGrads, which had itself later become commercialized as Eucalyptus Systems, beginnings of this hybrid cloud movement. NASA additionally contributed to the OpenStack community. And in fact, I would argue, one of the founding and enabling partners for OpenStack, which you find today at the heart of a great deal of technology within HP. So we have pockets, as we've had in our past. The challenge is to find a way at scale to close this technological and innovation gap that we obviously speak of when we talk about governments around the world. So I thought what I might do is to share a little bit about how I thought of this question of the technological and innovation gap by providing for you a little bit more context on the President's overall strategy for innovation. This formula has its applicability in nations all around the world, but it has a very straightforward construct. Nations are at their best when they invest in infrastructure. And in the traditional sense of economic growth, that had been seen as roadways, railways, and runways. And in today's increasingly connected global marketplace, it means digital infrastructure. Thinking about mobile broadband, thinking about smartening up the electrical grid, modernizing our healthcare systems with the adoption of information technology. So at the foundation of the President's strategy is a rethinking about the role of government, in this case as an investor in the enabling capabilities, investing in that digital infrastructure. Second, the notion that we have to adopt rules of the road that ensure that as we become more digital, that we're balancing the challenging priorities of privacy and security along the way. And then last but certainly not least, that we take a new approach to problem solving, one that looks a lot more like the private sector's use of open innovation than a traditional top-down government-led program. Combined, these three elements comprise the core of a formula the President rolled out to suggest this is how we achieve growth without the kind of turbulence that we had seen in the first half of this century. So I thought to give you a little bit more context around how, not only in the United States context, but around the world, we've seen these elements be brought to life. First, with a bit of a personal journey. You can probably guess from my surname that my family comes from India. And while my parents were proud that I had the honor and privilege of serving as a report to the President, it was not until I was able to accompany the President on his trip to India that Mom and Dad really found that teary-eyed love. And it was an interesting time. 90 days before our arrival with the President, I was doing some prep work, and I had the pleasure of visiting with my counterpart in India. Many of you might know Sam Petroda. And at the time, Sam had been thinking about digital infrastructure and thought that the occasion of the President's visit might offer a wonderful opportunity to showcase what had been a vision and a strategy he had been working on with his team. And the notion was to think differently about rural economic development. And the specific initiative we thought to showcase was that of an e-panchayat. In India, like many parts of the world, the most direct form of government in a rural village wouldn't necessarily be tied to a specific state government or a federal government, but would be really representative of the local communities, the panchayat, the village center. And at this 90-day mark, Sam thought it'd be useful for us to go visit one of these communities that had a panchayat up and running to think about what that might mean for the community over the next 90 days. So he picked a community that happened to be close enough to Delhi that we could get there by bus. And we came to a place where the roadway stopped. Dirt. We found our way into the panchayat, and we recognized that very little had traditional forms of infrastructure, indoor plumbing, electricity, very limited amounts of capacity in the village. Maybe a little bit to the center, but it stopped basically at that juncture. Sam decided to bring fiber broadband to this particular village and to communicate out from the village center through 4G WiMAX towers. I joked with Sam that he put more infrastructure into this village than we had in most parts of the United States at the time. And we wondered, could the delivery of government services through this new digital channel in a community that had barely yet caught up with the rest of the modern concepts of infrastructure do anything? It was a bit of an experiment. Sam digitized the community and dispatched an early roster of government apps so that the community and the stakeholders who were visiting the community could get to work. And we put a calendar on the item on the president's calendar that he would interact with this community through basically a high-definition broadband connection and learn firsthand from the villagers what had changed in their lives these past 90 days. He heard 3 very specific and compelling stories that really speak to the possibilities of this new digital infrastructure around the world. First, in a bit of awkwardness, a farmer stood up and shared with the president that a year earlier he had some difficulty getting a certified copy of his land records, which was an important government document in order for him to get a loan to borrow money to buy seeds for his farm. And he had described visiting a sort of an urban center where perhaps he had a difficult time working with the government agency rep and failed to come out with his certified land record. It forced him to use a high-cost moneylender to access his, basically access the capital for him to run the farm. But thanks to this initiative, he was able to walk into the village center, the panchayat, and essentially print out a certified copy of his land record, go straight to the bank, borrow money at regular rates, and was able to live and thrive as his family had anticipated. A young man stood up who had been facing that difficult choice. He was a graduate student studying for his MBA, but got the call that his grandmother had fallen ill in the village and that he was the only able-bodied adult that could care for her during her hour of need. Either he would have to drop out of his MBA course and visit with her, or he would have to choose his future and his studies but leave grandmother without support. Thankfully, he was able to take his courses through remote distance learning models and allowed him to basically cut that problem in half. And finally, a nurse who had been visiting the village consistently to help immunize the children and make sure that they had gotten their proper preventive services, had now been given the answer at her fingertips as to the real-time immunization status of the patients, the children that lived in the community. In response to this, the president's only answer was the following. You know, one of the incredible benefits of technology, he said, is that it can essentially position one to leapfrog some of the intermediate stages of government service delivery, avoiding some of the 20th century mechanisms and going straight to the 21st. That notion of leapfrog is central to the idea of an innovative state. That we can bring about a whole new set of capabilities without having to worry about all the messes that we've seen in the more mature markets that have adopted first-generation technologies. It's important to acknowledge that while this digital infrastructure is just now taking hold throughout the world, getting the rules of the road right is absolutely essential. We've seen a lot of time and attention paid to the notion that while we digitize records that had been previously either on manila folders or in other forms of inaccessible media, that while we connect these resources digitally and then eventually network them through internet technologies, that we have to be more mindful of security and privacy policy. Here too, the president led with the notion of multi-stakeholder collaboration, that while there are some things we can do top-down from the centers of government throughout the world, much of the success in these two domains will be driven by private sector collaboration, perhaps convened and supported by the public sector, but not led by. And you can see, just as an example, some of the areas that have gotten us quite engaged. This, on the left, you'll see material from DARPA that just kind of makes it obvious the security threat that we face. While the lines of code necessary to attack us can remain minuscule, infinitesimal, the amount of capability, the collective code base for all of today's modern security programs continue to escalate. And in the words of DARPA, this notion of an asymmetrical threat, that small sort of attack vectors on a large surface area inevitably can render even the most secure systems vulnerable, suggests to us that we've got to change the nature of the game, that we're going to have to find ways through the public and private sector to reimagine what security looks like in the 21st century. And you can see, even in the United States, a bipartisan endorsement of a public-private partnership model, even as recently as this last December, when Republican Senator Thune and Democratic Senator Jay Rockefeller ushered in essentially an endorsement for how we can work with the private sector to modernize our security standards. And while we're not there yet on privacy, the President's Internet Privacy Bill of Rights gives us a roadmap on how we might see this too make progress. Those of us that think about selling digital services into the domains of public and regulated sectors understand very clearly that a lot of the hesitancy to go digital is the concern about sensitive, regulated privacy risks, whether it be in healthcare or energy or any of the government agencies. Here too, we see a movement around a shift from simply yes, no, protection of privacy or not, to a world of empowering the consumer with the ability to set those individual privacy controls, allowing patients, for example, the authority to not only access their medical records, but to share them with whomever they trust, and revoke that sharing with the simple click of a button. So these principles, in combination with the digital infrastructure that we're starting to see widely adopted, are only the table stakes for what truly will be the formula for problem solving in the 21st century. And that's the notion of open innovation. A word about what inspired my approach to this phenomenon before I get into the specifics of public sector innovation. First, I thought long and hard when the President gave me the assignment to close this innovation gap to make sure we studied from the best and the brightest. And my colleagues at a research firm called the Corporate Executive Board had written a study in the late 1990s that said, why is it that seemingly indestructible companies hit some proverbial stall point and struggle to get back up on their feet? What is it about this repeated pattern of wildly successful meets a stumble? And it turns out that among the many reasons, chief among them is the organization's inability to manage an innovation pipeline. Plenty of companies can invent lots of ideas. It's scaling those ideas through the marketplace that is what separates out invention from innovation. And that the key in resolving this innovation pipeline breakdown is to adopt three very basic principles that I use to inform our public sector strategy. First is understanding the importance of culture. The CEO of Procter & Gamble, A.G. Lafley, famously said that 50% of all new products and services would be delivered, or born, I should say, from ideas outside of their internal famed lab network. Now, this was awkward. I became very good friends with Bruce Brown, the Chief Technology Officer of Procter & Gamble, and I asked him, what does it feel like to have the boss wake up one morning and say you're only good for half the output? Was it discouraging? Did you feel somehow that you let the team down? And quite the opposite. This had actually given Bruce and his team license to seek ideas that they had always felt could be useful, but weren't born internally, and thus were not seen to be valuable. So I said, Bruce, where did you find some of your early wins? And he said, ironically, the federal government. And I said, no, Bruce, don't just tell something to me to make me feel good because I work in the government. What do you mean? He said, I'll tell you the story about diapers. I said, okay, you like to see how diapers have anything to do with the federal government, but okay. He said, well, it turns out that making diapers at 1,000 a minute is particularly challenging because we're so smart about diapers. We've found this water-absorbing material that's pretty sensitive, and we can deposit that material in just the right spot in order to maximize the water absorption, or I should say, the number one absorption. And I said to Bruce, I said, okay, but where are you going with this? He says, Aneesh, at the scale and production that we have, we're not always at our best in adopting the right amount of that material in just the right spot. But it turns out that a government agency is particularly good at this, and it's in how we make nuclear weapons. I said, okay, Bruce, you've got me. Talk to me. It turns out that the modeling and simulation techniques necessary to ensure that there is absolute efficient depositing of nuclear material on a warhead or any other nuclear device is absolutely relevant and applicable to how they apply this sensitive water-absorbing material into the diaper. By taking that technology from, it was an open technology that you could have access to from one of the Energy Department labs, he was able to generate $1 billion cash flow improvement to Procter & Gamble's bottom line. I was so impressed with the story, I told him he had to share this with the president himself. This is the picture of him doing so. It made the president ad-lib his remarks at the next speech, something about diapers and military warheads, and it was very funny. Second, Jeff Bezos at Amazon. We understood that for open innovation to work, it's not so much about just external actors, but thinking about frontline workers within the enterprise. The federal civilian non-military workforce, over 3 million folks. And the question that was very obvious in this second case study was the degree to which we were tapping into their expertise to solve problems. Bezos famously had been touring one of the departments, the customer service department, and had fielded a phone call from someone who complained about damaged furniture. I'm sure presumably responded very what you would imagine a CEO to do. Thank you for your call. We apologize. We'll send you a new piece of furniture. Thank you for calling Amazon. To which, after the call, he hears muttered behind his shoulder something to the effect of, that happens all the time. And he turns around and he asks this customer service rep, excuse me, but what do you mean this happens all the time? Oh, that was the 4th complaint this week about that particular furniture maker and the damaged goods that come from it. And he says, well, did you report this to anyone? And the employee said, well, who am I supposed to report this to? You? And it uncovered this obvious flaw of feedback loops. So Amazon offers this concept of an andon cord, borrowing from the lean production system at Toyota. If an employee senses that there's a defective item in the catalog, they have the right to remove it from the catalog without their supervisor's approval. In fact, the supervisor can't put the item back into the catalog until they've done an exhaustive root cause analysis. I thought, my goodness, what an empowering message to frontline workers. I wonder how many frontline federal workers in the VA and other departments could really take advantage of this open invitation to innovate, to surface opportunities where we can make a difference. But last and certainly not least in our race to best practices have been the story of what Facebook had done in the building out of their developer platform. I had the pleasure of joining Sheryl Sandberg at one of these events talking about jobs in the economy. And in preparation, she had asked her team, I believe Facebook at the time had roughly 3,000 employees-ish, and the question was asked, how many of them had the title Facebook developer? And with bated breath, I was keen to see the answer to this question. You know, is it a developer-friendly organization? Is it a big share of their team? What does it look like? And lo and behold, the answer came back, and it was something north of 35,000. Now, many of you in this room are pretty smart. I would imagine you're good at math. And you would say that A and B don't compute. And the answer is that Facebook had opened up its developer platform, so if HP wanted to build a Facebook application on HP's payroll, it had the freedom and right to do so. And this notion of building apps on top of a proverbial platform got us thinking, my goodness, at that same leverage, could 30 million Americans literally be writing apps to help people access workforce delivery services, healthcare services, energy, support services? So we thought about this strategy in the public sector, and it became very clear to us that there were 4 very specific things that we could do. And these 4 things every government can do, especially in areas where they both directly influence the services of a given area or they regulate the services in a given area. And we describe these 4 with the metaphor of a handshake and a handoff. What's unique about the principles of open innovation in the public sector, at least in the United States context, is that they have already achieved bipartisan support. Handshakes. In Washington, we are bitterly divided. The left and the right can hardly agree on anything, but they have on these 4 policy levers. The handoff is the key ingredient of an innovative state, the key attribute. The handoff suggests that just because the government can open up its assets does not mean miraculously problems get solved. We need thoughtful handoffs to a growing ecosystem of entrepreneurs and innovators in the public, private, nonprofit, academic sectors of the global economy who can take that raw capability from the public sector and to build out those last mile services. Handshakes and handoffs are the formula for innovative states at all levels of government and at all areas of the world. And it's all about tapping into the expertise of the population to solve big problems. What are the key elements of an innovative state? Well, 1, an innovative state opens up more of its data for reuse. 2, it facilitates barriers to entry reducing standards so that others, the playing field can be widened for others to participate. It issues challenges and prizes to find non-traditional solvers. And where appropriate, it recruits public and private sector entrepreneurs to work on very well-defined problems through what we refer to as lean government startups. A word on each. Open data has been as important to this country as the founding of our republic. Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson for those of us in Virginia who call him, had been our nation's first open data innovator. He famously recorded the weather every day, twice a day, including on that fateful July 4th, 1776, where we learned the weather in Philadelphia was particularly comfortable. When he became President Jefferson, he dispatched Lewis and Clark to travel the West and instructed them to record data that would be freely available upon their return. The spirit of Jefferson has lived on in the weather economy that has now been born into a $5+ billion annual industry, where the federal government bears the brunt of the investment in satellites and sensor networks to collect the data, but agrees to open up a hose, an API, onto that data to anyone who wishes to build valuable products and services on top. That notion of opening up the data with limited intellectual property constraint and with maximum ability for reuse and commercialization is at the heart of what we refer to as the digital services playbook that every government around the world is beginning to evaluate and many are considering to adopt. And to call one aspect of that playbook, one of my favorite provisions, is the notion that we should default to open. And that notion is that government shall publish data sets to the public in their entirety through bulk downloads and APIs. And this notion of connecting entrepreneurs to public data sets is at the heart of our innovative state. We're starting to see this play out in a number of domains, but to be very specific about the opportunity, McKinsey has estimated between $3 to $5 trillion of economic value are ready to be uncovered and unleashed if we can open up more data in these key regulated sectors of the global economy. These figures are estimates of consumer surplus, Some of that might be translated into revenue growth and revenue opportunity. Climate Corporation, for example, pieced together multiple government data sets on weather and census and farming and used them to build brand new products for crop insurance. They were so successful, their big data-driven crop insurance product business, that the Monsanto Corporation paid nearly $1 billion to acquire what was essentially 2 or 3 dozen data scientists' work. There's economic opportunity to be had in each and every one of these domains. And it begs the question, when you think about how you sell to the public sector, it's not so much about that decision of that public sector CIO to say, what's the infrastructure or the application stack that I'm looking for, but increasingly it's about what are the data assets you'll be putting into that infrastructure? How open and accessible will those data assets be? How might you partner to help them unleash the value of those data assets? And they may not often be economic assets. My wife and I have 3 little kids. It turns out that in the United States, 50% of all infant car seats are improperly installed. My wife and I have this big SUV, and I got to stick my knee in the thing and push hard, and push the thing in to make sure the thing's installed correctly. And I didn't know there were resources to help me. Who knew that the Department of Transportation has a database of the ease of implementation for every car seat, infant car seat sold in the United States? I could have looked up the database and held a very clear contrast to see which one would be easier. And more importantly, we have a geocoded database of every location in the country you could go to test whether or not your car seat was properly installed. An employee of the Transportation Department unveiled the fact that these data sets exist over a weekend hackathon. By that Sunday night, someone had built an iPhone app, and my wife and I used it the very next day to go find the place to check our improperly installed car seat. So these valuable assets may not be what the department thought of initially as the main reason for collecting the data, but their reuse is at the heart of opportunity to create value. The second idea dates back to a Republican idea in the United States that was born of former President Herbert Hoover. Now, for those of us who study history, and those of you who are outside of the United States, this is not one you would normally assume to be a best practice cited in any research study. Herbert Hoover presided over the Great Depression. And so you wonder, why is Aneesh Chopra talking about Herbert Hoover? Well, it turns out before he was president, he was Secretary of Commerce. And he had faced a conundrum. At the end of World War I, the United States production of aircraft plummeted. Quality, not just in the US, but around the world, wasn't all that great in aircraft production, but it was seen as a very important growth industry. Europe invested heavily in building up competitive companies for airline manufacturing, and many were building better and more aircraft than the United States. So the Commerce Secretary fielded a number of calls. Could you, in fact, reduce the gap between what the Europeans were funding and what we were doing on our own? Could you subsidize our industry to give us a fighting chance? Well, Hoover wasn't ideologically disposed to subsidizing a sector of the economy, didn't want to pick winners and losers. So he thought about the next best thing. He said, what if you guys identified common problems, and maybe we could together, in a collaborative way, tackle them? And that might warrant public investment. It turns out that one of the two of the big challenges in aircraft production were designing engine airfoils, engine cowlings, and wing airfoils. So Hoover decides to create the predecessor to NASA and allows them to collaborate with the private sector to standardize the designs. And wouldn't you know it, the dominating planes of their era, the DC-3 and the Boeing 247, share the intellectual property from the predecessor to NASA for engine cowlings and airfoils. This idea that the government can collaborate to foster technical interoperability and standards adoption is at the heart of our digital strategies by opening up healthcare and energy and education, and dare I say, even the military's warfighter app store. While not in production, under our watch in the first term, DARPA had invested in a new program called Transformative Apps. The idea was, rather than the Pentagon picking the one Pashtun to English translator to rule them all through some big bloated procurement, what if we had the equivalent of an open model where standards were published and entrepreneurs and innovators could bring their apps to the App Store, and they'd only get paid for use. If the warfighter downloaded and used their Pashtun to English translator, then perhaps we might foster this marketplace. And while this is an R&D initiative, it speaks to this broader notion that while we lower barriers to entry through standards, we might spark a great deal more entrepreneurial activity and ingenuity, and in this case, to solve very specific and direct public sector challenges. Which leads us to our third initiative. Not everything can be solved by RFP. In the late 1600s, early 1700s, we had a difficult time globally dealing with the issue of basically calculating longitude at sea. And after a naval disaster in Scilly, the British government decided that they would offer up a prize. You see, they had turned to their leading physicist of their time, a certain someone you might know as Sir Isaac Newton. And they said, "Oh, Sir Isaac Newton, Godfather, can you please help us figuring out how we can determine longitude at sea so we can save lives and be more successful as a nation?" Even Sir Isaac Newton couldn't solve the conundrum or the puzzle. So they decided to offer a 20,000-pound prize, the longitude prize, well over $3 million in today's currency, to anyone who could solve this particularly vexing problem. And lo and behold, Harrison, a watchmaker, probably not on the list of people anyone was planning to call to solve this problem, emerges with what became the chronometer. The modern day version of this is what DARPA had attempted to do in its crowdsourcing initiative to deal with the problem of high unit costs of military equipment production. Now, this is a particularly depressing statistic in the United States. In the 1980s, one of the defense secretaries, one of the assistant secretaries, a very famous gentleman named Norm Augustine, had made a joke. At the rate of unit cost inflation to produce one combat aircraft, the entirety of the DoD budget by the year 2054 would only buy us one combat aircraft, and it would have to be shared by the Air Force, the Marines, and the Navy. Now, that sounded like a joke. The Economist in 2012, 30 years later, went back and plotted the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35. And you would imagine, but be depressed to know, that we are right on track with Augustine's law. So the military said, we don't need a 5% or a 10% improvement in productivity. We need like a 50, 60, 70, 80% productivity improvement. And we're not going to do it by relying on the same half a dozen Beltway bandits who've been at the heart of our procurement strategy. We're going to have to cast a wider net. So they decided to do an experiment. This particular experiment was funny. They allowed contestants only 3 weeks to design a combat support vehicle that could medevac 2 injured soldiers from the battlefield. Now, mind you, it takes 3 weeks for a typical government agency to put a comma into an RFP. So here they wanted the answer, not the RFP. And they found Victor Garcia, who earlier in his life had been a waiter at a restaurant in the US called Sizzler. Yep, Sizzler. He had seen one of those TV ads while he was waiting tables. You too can design automobiles. Sign up for this XYZ Technical Institute. And he signed up, and he graduated. And, you know, he didn't end up at the top of the league tables for recruiting. He didn't get a job at Ford, GM, or Chrysler. He ended up as a contract employee at a trucking company. And as a contract employee, he didn't have health insurance, and so his wife gets pregnant, and they're blessed, but of course, he needs to buy health insurance to make sure she's got a safe pregnancy, and so he is looking for work. He sees that DARPA announces on Twitter and on Facebook to 20,000 plus designers that they're going to give away whatever it was, $10,000 prize to the best design to solve this particular conundrum. And Victor went to work. 3 hard weeks, and off he went to produce what we then got to know to be the flip mode vehicle. It was then converted from a design into a production car, and one of my best days at the White House was picking up the phone and calling DARPA and asking if Victor and the team could make their way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Because the President of the United States, who was announcing the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, wanted to personally say thank you to the team. To tell us that in every corner of the country, and for many of you who serve countries around the world, in every village, every neighborhood, every community, we have a Victor or a Victoria Garcia ready to be tapped to solve big problems. And we are starting to see the fruits of this labor in production-ready systems. In the United States, our veterans have a difficult time scheduling appointments. They can't use the internet to schedule. You and I can schedule dinner reservations tonight here in Vegas on our smartphones. But if you're a veteran and you're trying to find a doctor, you can't schedule that online appointment. Sounds pathetic. So we spent 9 years and $125 million trying to build the technology to do this, only to learn that not a single line of code was working. So we had to throw the whole thing away. And rather than start from scratch, we said, well, why don't we try one of these design concepts? What if we applied the same principles of a competition that allowed us to find Victor into how to solve the problem of scheduling? So we opened up a competition, and exactly what we wished happened. 3 winners. A startup, which we sort of expected. A startup might show up out of nowhere to demonstrate that they could successfully process a transaction. A hospital, who probably never in a million years thought of themselves as government contractors. They had separately adopted the Vista code base, had built this feature out for themselves, and when they heard about the competition, they said, just take our code base. And it worked. And with respect to my friends today at Hewlett-Packard organized the 3rd winning team, an open collaboration with all these stakeholders, bringing the best and the brightest from what I would consider to be traditional government procurement with this entrepreneurial mindset, and demonstrating that all 3 could coexist in this new innovative state. Last but not least, the notion of a lean government startup, and the idea at the heart of it that there are talented people inside government and outside government who yearn to find ways to work together to tackle specific and well-defined problems. Here you see in World War II, Republican GM Chairman Knudsen bowing and shaking the hands of Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of several hundred executives who joined the Roosevelt administration at the whopping $1 a year salary to help ensure that we had a sufficient supply chain for the war effort. That notion of serving country carries through the Kennedy administration, where he asks, are you good enough for government? We're starting to see that same mantra take hold, at least in the United States context. My successor as U.S. Chief Technology Officer, Todd Park, brought to bear a brand new initiative called the Presidential Innovation Fellowship Program. And here you can see President Obama talking to a bunch of those entrepreneurial recruits who joined hands with government agency entrepreneurs, often in equal numbers, to go after very specific problem areas, like procurement, which I generally think is evil and wrong and bad, but hard to fix. These entrepreneurs designed a brand new Match.com for entrepreneurs and agencies of need. They said, let's start small, website development. For website development projects that are estimated to be less than a couple $100,000, we're going to allow the agency to bypass the traditional fedbizops.gov website, which, believe it or not, is the name of the U.S. procurement site, fedbizops.gov, you can't make that up. And to say, what if we could allow anyone, 2 kids in a garage, big companies, anyone in between? What if we allowed a new mechanism to connect agencies of need with entrepreneurs and problem solvers who can meet the need? Well, exactly as you imagine happened. The good people at RFP-EZ, as the team was called, they decided to run 5 procurements. Each of them went through FedBizOps, the traditional way, and each of them went through the RFP-EZ platform. And wouldn't you think what happened? Hundreds of companies that had never done business with the government before showed up. On average, prices fell 30%, and the quality was better than agencies had ever expected. And we're starting to see that spirit hold in departments that may not necessarily see themselves as tech agencies, like NASA might, or some of the other federal agencies. We had a startup in the Obama administration, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And among its first assignments was to design a simple mortgage disclosure form, under the premise that a lot of people took out bad mortgages partially because they didn't understand the terms and conditions that they had to fill out in the paperwork. Well, for political reasons, we couldn't get new rules promulgated. We had to have a director that the Senate had confirmed, and they were delaying that process. But that didn't stop the agency from thinking about an entrepreneurial approach. They launched a website, knowbeforeyouowe.org, and they invited what ultimately became 13,000 people to help co-create and design the mortgage disclosure form. You can see some of the heat maps that came out of that process, which allowed the President of the United States to stand up before the American people with a form built by and for the American people before this had even gone into rulemaking in traditional Washington parlance. So I want to end my remarks with a few quick observations about the world as we see it. I began with a bit of an homage to healthcare.gov and the recovery of what was a very embarrassing experience for those of us in the public sector. But I want to harken back to the original healthcare.gov to share with you how an innovative state would work. In the March of 2010 timeframe, the President signed the Affordable Care Act into law in the United States. But the story of healthcare.gov starts 3 months earlier, when a designer in New Jersey by the name of Ed Mullen, and you can see his picture barely in the corner of one of those graphics, starts to realize that the debate in Washington is missing something so fundamental. If only the American people could see what a health exchange looks like, maybe they would like it and rally behind it. So, Ed Mullen takes it upon himself to design myhealth.gov, a prototype for what the health exchange might look like in January. And thanks to Twitter, he mentions my colleague Macon Phillips at the White House, and we immediately see this incredible work. Like, who's Ed Mullen? We call Ed Mullen. We recruit Ed Mullen to be the chief designer for healthcare.gov. And you can see within 90 days, which the law said we had to have a working prototype in 90 days, which meant by July 1, we had to have a working database, a comprehensive list of every public and private insurance product sold in the entire country had to be searchable and accessible in an Expedia.com-like fashion. Well, the final product is what you see on the right. It looks a lot like the design that Ed had designed back in January. And it was so successful, the President thought it'd be okay for him to be the first president in the country, in the history, to actually walk through or demo an app. He demoed healthcare.gov. But here's the most important point. We didn't particularly care if anyone visited healthcare.gov. You see, we opened up an API, inviting anyone to take the data and to put it on whatever site they wanted. U.S. News and World Report opened up for the first time a health insurance finder that was 100% powered by the data we made available from healthcare.gov. Hundreds of companies, small or large, have built their own healthcare.gov on top of the data that had been made publicly available. It suggests to me that we're entering a new era in this innovative state, the notion that we're starting to think about talent in a different and better way. And while the United States is certainly leading in many of these aspects, nations around the world are participating. Just take a look at what the President has done in the last several months. He's recruited a third Chief Technology Officer, Megan Smith, who had previously been at Google X, to be the nation's third Chief Technology Officer. As her deputy, she recruits AMAC, who had been General Counsel at Twitter, and DJ Patel,